Your great-grandparents could preserve a harvest for an entire winter without a single jar, a single can, a single modern tool. They could store meat that wouldn't spoil for months. They could keep vegetables fresh through snow and ice, using nothing but a hole in the ground. And when spring came, they opened root cellars that had kept food alive through temperatures that would destroy every refrigerator on the block. But here's the thing nobody talks about anymore. The real survival skill wasn't the storage method. It was understanding water. It was mastering moisture. And nowhere, absolutely nowhere, is this knowledge more crucial than in the one food your ancestors trusted their lives to during the long, dark months when everything else ran out. Bread. Not fancy bread. Not decorated bread. The kind of bread that could survive weeks, that could be dunked in soup and still hold together, that could feed a family when nothing else could. The Amish understood something about bread that we've completely forgotten, and it has almost nothing to do with the recipe. I spent 3 months last year talking with Amish families across Pennsylvania and Ohio, and I asked every single one of them the same question: what's the secret to bread that lasts? And every answer was different. One family told me their grandmother used a specific ratio of salt. Another swore it was the temperature of the water. A third said the flour itself was the answer. Nobody agreed. But when I watched them actually make the bread, when I saw their hands move and felt the dough they were working with, something became obvious. They were all doing the exact same thing, whether they knew it or not. They weren't thinking about moisture retention. They weren't thinking about gluten structure. They were thinking about one word: practice. Not in the way we use it now. Not as in, you practice piano until you get better. I mean practice in the old sense. The sense where your hands know things your mind doesn't. Where years of touching the same dough, feeling it change, adjusting without thinking, that's the skill. That's what survives. That's what gets passed down. But that's not what I came here to tell you. Because there's something underneath that, something your ancestors understood about bread that changes everything. The modern survival expert will tell you that bread preservation is about controlling fermentation, about timing, about keeping yeast alive just long enough and then killing it at exactly the right moment. The Amish don't think about it that way at all. They think about it the way a farmer thinks about soil. You're not trying to control it. You're trying to work with what's already there. You're trying to understand what wants to happen, and then you let it happen on its own terms. When you walk into an Amish bakery, and I mean a real one, the kind that feeds a community, not a tourist attraction, the first thing that hits you is the smell. Not sweet, not vanilla, something older, something like the smell of earth after rain, mixed with yeast and salt and something mineral that you can't quite name. That smell is information. It's a language. It's telling you everything about what's happening inside that bread. And the baker can read it. They can smell a loaf from 20 feet away and tell you exactly how much longer it needs, whether the fermentation is right, whether the crust will hold for a week or 2 weeks, or whether this batch is at its peak today and needs to be eaten fresh. Modern industrial bread, and I mean the stuff made in factories, the kind with 12-month shelf lives and ingredient lists longer than your arm, that bread is dead before it ever reaches the store. It's been processed until it can't ferment anymore. The yeast is dead. The bacteria that would naturally acidify the dough, that would create the chemical barriers that keep mold and spoilage away, those are killed off. So instead, they add preservatives. Chemical preservatives. Things invented in laboratories that have never existed in human food before. And now, quietly, even the companies that make them are running away from them. They know something we're starting to figure out. Dead food needs dead chemicals to stay dead long enough to sell. Living food preserves itself. This is not a moral argument. This is not me saying industrial bread is evil and Amish bread is pure. This is me saying, if you want bread that survives, you need bread that's still alive. The secret that your ancestors knew, and that changes the entire equation of bread as a survival food, is this: fermentation time is preservation time. Every hour that dough ferments before you bake it, acids are forming inside. Lactic acid, acetic acid, the same acids that pickle vegetables and cure meat. These acids create an environment where mold can't grow, where unwanted bacteria can't survive. An Amish family making bread the traditional way isn't rushing fermentation. They're not using commercial yeast packets that work in 2 hours. They're using starters, cultures that have been alive in their kitchen for generations. I met a woman named Martha who has been feeding the same sourdough starter for 47 years. 47 years. The culture that's alive in her crock right now contains bacteria and yeast that her grandmother introduced into it in 1977. That's a living, breathing archive, and the bread it makes doesn't just last longer. It tastes different. It smells different. It develops flavors that you literally cannot create any other way. Here's what this means for survival. Your ancestors didn't store bread. They baked bread. Constantly. Because living bread, properly fermented bread, naturally resists spoilage for weeks. A loaf of bread made with a true fermented starter, baked properly, dried to the right moisture level, can sit on a shelf for a month without going moldy. 2 months if the conditions are right. 3 months if you know what you're doing. But industrial bread goes moldy in 5 days. 5 days. And that's why in our world we have preservatives. In their world they had time. They had the willingness to let fermentation do its work, even if it meant planning your baking schedule 3 days in advance. They understood that patience, actual biological patience, was a preservation technology that never needed to be invented. It just needed to be trusted. Now, here's where it gets practical. Because understanding this changes how you bake, and it changes how you think about bread as a survival food. Most people make bread once. They follow a recipe. They get a result. If it works, great. If not, they try a different recipe. They're treating bread like a machine you adjust, when really, it's an organism you're learning to partner with. The Amish approach is completely different. When a girl in an Amish household turns 13 or 14, she doesn't learn bread from a cookbook. She spends 6 months, sometimes longer, making the same loaf the same way every single day. She's not trying to master a recipe. She's learning to feel what's happening. She's learning what the dough should feel like at different stages. She's learning to recognize when it's ready by touch, not by a timer. She's learning the rhythm of fermentation in her particular kitchen, with her particular water and her particular stove and the particular climate where she lives. This knowledge, this embodied knowledge, is not transferable to a YouTube video. You can't watch it. You have to do it. And this is the part that modern survival culture gets completely wrong. We want the information. We want the shortcut. We want the cheat code that gets us to the result without the process. We watch a 10-minute video and we think we know how to make sourdough. We follow a recipe exactly, and we think we understand bread. But your ancestors understood that some knowledge only lives in your hands. Some skills only transfer through time and repetition and failure and adjustment. You can't compress that. You can't skip that. And if you try, if you just read instructions and expect to produce bread that lasts, you'll fail. And then you'll blame the recipe, or the flour, or the water, when really, you'll have blamed the thing that actually matters. You skipped the learning. You wanted mastery without apprenticeship. And the bread knows. The dough knows. It responds to hands that know what they're doing, and it rebels against hands that don't. This is why I spent those 3 months asking Amish bakers the same question over and over, getting different answers, and realizing that the differences didn't matter. The salt ratios, the water temperatures, the fermentation times, these were all different because every kitchen is different. Every climate is different. Every water source is different. What was the same was the presence, the attention, the willingness to adjust because you'd made this bread 100 times before and you knew what normal felt like, so you could recognize when something was different. This is a skill that cannot be rushed. It cannot be outsourced. It cannot be replaced by a timer or a thermometer or an instruction card. Your ancestors didn't have timers, and they didn't need them, because they had made bread so many times that they didn't need to measure time. They measured readiness. They felt it. They knew it. This is the secret that changes everything about bread as a survival food. It's not that the recipe is magic. It's that the hands that make it have been trained through years of repetition to respond to what the dough actually needs, not what an instruction says it should need. And this is why the Amish approach to bread making has kept communities alive through winters, droughts, and lean years. It's not because their recipe is written down somewhere in a secret book. It's because every girl in every Amish household has spent years, not days, not weeks, but years, standing beside her mother or grandmother, learning not what the bread should do, but how to recognize what it's actually doing. She's learned the texture of dough at different humidity levels. She knows how a kitchen feels different in spring than in winter. She can tell by the smell alone whether the fermentation has gone far enough or if it needs more time. This knowledge lives in her hands and in her senses, not in her memory of instructions. Now, here's where most of us go wrong when we try to recreate this. We think we need to replicate the exact conditions, the exact temperature, the exact timing, the exact ingredients from the exact region where the Amish live. We think if we buy the right flour or use the right water, we'll get the same result. But the result we get depends almost entirely on whether we've put in the time to build the intuition. And that intuition doesn't come from watching a video or reading a blog post. It comes from making the bread repeatedly, failing sometimes, adjusting, and learning to trust your senses more than your timer. The old survival skill here isn't actually about bread. Bread is just the example. The actual skill is presence, attention, the ability to show up to a task repeatedly and learn from small variations, rather than running toward the same guaranteed outcome every single time. This is what your great-grandparents knew that you don't. They understood that reliable food production wasn't about perfection. It was about consistency born from repetition, and about the flexibility to adjust when conditions changed. When the Amish make bread during a harsh winter, they don't follow the summer recipe exactly. They know the kitchen is colder. They know the dough will rise slower. They might add slightly warmer water. They might give the dough more time. They might check it 3 times instead of once. This is adaptive thinking. This is survival intelligence. And it's the opposite of what we're taught to do now, which is to find the perfect system and then never deviate from it. Before matches were invented in 1826, people carried fire starters made from flint and steel everywhere. But long before that, for thousands of years, people who worked with bread had something even more valuable: the ability to know when their dough was ready without any tool at all. Not a thermometer, not a timer, not a rise indicator, just their own senses, trained and sharpened through repetition until they were as reliable as any machine. The Amish understand something that's almost completely lost in modern food culture: that the most valuable skill isn't having the right equipment. It's having the right relationship to your work. When you make bread as a machine, measure this, set that, wait exactly this long, the bread becomes fragile. It becomes dependent on those exact conditions. But when you make bread as a practiced craft, where your hands and your intuition are the primary tools, the bread becomes resilient. It adapts. It works whether your kitchen is 65 degrees or 75 degrees. It works whether your water is hard or soft. It works because you've trained yourself to feel what it needs, not to follow what a recipe says it should do. This is the second survival layer in bread making that nobody talks about. The first layer is the recipe itself, the basic science of flour, water, salt, and time. But the second layer is the presence of mind to keep making it, again and again, until you stop being a follower of instructions and become a practitioner of a skill. And that transformation only happens through repetition. Think about what this meant for a family living 150 years ago. If bread failed sometimes because the baker was distracted or didn't pay attention, people went hungry. So there was real pressure to build mastery. There was a consequence to not showing up fully to the work. In our world, we can order bread from a store if ours doesn't work out. So the pressure to develop this skill is gone. And with the pressure gone, most of us never develop it. But here's what happens when you do decide to put in that time. When you commit to making bread twice a week for a month, then a season, then a year, your confidence grows, your troubleshooting improves, you start to recognize patterns, you start to know, without checking, whether your dough has fermented enough. You start to adjust your process automatically without even thinking about it. You become the kind of person who could feed a family with flour and water and salt and fire, and do it reliably, in almost any season. The Amish way of bread making teaches something much deeper than recipes. It teaches the importance of building competence through practice. It teaches that survival, whether survival in a crisis or simply survival through seasons of plenty and scarcity, depends on skills that live in your hands and your judgment, not in written instructions or timers on your phone. And there's one more thing the plain communities understand about bread that keeps it working as a survival staple across generations. It's about storage. A loaf of bread from a store lasts maybe 3 or 4 days before it hardens or molds. But bread made the old way, with proper fermentation and the right flour, can last much longer. Some Amish families keep loaves that are a week old and they're still soft enough to eat. Why? Because the fermentation process creates acids in the dough that act as natural preservatives. The gluten development creates a tighter crumb structure that doesn't dry out as quickly. The crust that forms in a proper oven creates a moisture barrier that slows staling. This is crucial for understanding bread as a survival food. It's not just about being able to make it, it's about the fact that bread made properly keeps. It doesn't need refrigeration. It doesn't need special packaging. A loaf made with a long, slow fermentation and baked in a proper oven becomes a food that can sustain you for days. This is why bread has been the staple of survival, of armies, of families crossing continents for thousands of years. Not because it's the most nutritious food, but because it's dense in calories, it keeps reasonably well, it can be made from basic grains that store for years, and once you've learned how to make it, you don't need anything fancy to keep making it. The plain communities understood this in a way that modern home bakers often miss. When an Amish woman makes a large batch of bread, and I mean large, perhaps 8 or 10 loaves at a time, she's not doing it for a single meal. She's making bread that will feed her family for the week. And knowing that, she makes it the way that lasts. She gives it time. She lets it ferment fully. She bakes it until the crust is thick and protective. She understands, without needing a manual, that a properly made loaf is an investment in days of meals, not hours. This connects directly to another lost skill, the ability to think in terms of scale and time. We think of cooking as something that happens in an hour or less. The Amish think of it as something that unfolds over a day, or 2 days, or a season. Bread is one example, but this way of thinking applies to everything they do, to preserving food, to managing resources, to building shelter, to raising children. The understanding is, this work takes the time it takes, and the better you understand that going in, the less frustrated you become, and the better your results actually are. So when we talk about bread as a survival skill, we're not just talking about the mechanics. We're talking about a whole philosophy of work and time and attention. We're talking about the willingness to show up repeatedly, to pay attention, to adjust, and to trust the process even when modern life around you is screaming that everything should be instant. Native Americans could build a waterproof shelter in under 2 hours using only forest materials. The Amish can bake bread that lasts for days using only flour, water, salt, and fire. The common thread isn't the specific skill. It's the mastery that comes from repetition and presence. One more piece of this puzzle that I want you to understand, because it's where most people fail when they try to learn this skill themselves. The Amish don't just make bread. They talk about bread. They share techniques. They compare what worked and what didn't. There's a culture of continuous learning around the skill. When a new wife joins the community through marriage, the other women in her church don't just let her figure it out. They teach her. They watch her make it. They offer adjustments. They share their own struggles. This peer learning, this community around the skill, is what accelerates mastery. In our isolated modern lives, we try to learn these skills in private, from a recipe online or a video like this one, and that's useful. But it's not the full picture. The real acceleration happens when you have people around you who also care about the skill, when you can ask questions, when you can see someone else's hands doing it, when you can taste someone else's bread and understand that there are many correct ways to do it, not just one perfect way. So let me show you something else the Amish learned long ago, something they still do every single day, and something that most of us have completely forgotten. Water. Clean, safe water. Not from a tap, not from a bottle, from the earth itself. Before municipal water systems, every single household had to know how to find water that wouldn't kill them. And they didn't have test kits or laboratories, they had observation. They had knowledge passed down through generations about where water comes from, how to recognize clean water, and how to make questionable water safe using nothing but fire and time. The first principle is location. Moving water is almost always safer than still water. A spring, a creek, a river with current, these clean themselves as they flow. Stagnant ponds, water that sits in one place, that's where disease lives. That's where parasites breed. The Amish never forgot this. When they choose a homestead, water source is not secondary to them. It's primary. Everything else follows. Now, once you've found good moving water, the next step is making it absolutely certain. And here's where the old method still outperforms modern thinking. Boiling. Not some fancy filtration system, not chemicals. Heat, fire. The same method your ancestors used 500 years ago still works perfectly today. Because boiling doesn't just kill what you can see. It kills everything. Bacteria, viruses, parasites. the organisms that have no name but will make you desperately sick. The rule is simple and absolute. One rolling boil, a full minute at sea level. Higher elevation, you add more time. That's it. After 1 minute of true boiling, water that was questionable becomes water that's safe. No residue, no chemical taste, no plastic bottle. Just pure water that's been purified by the same force that purifies everything else in nature, heat. But there's another method the plain communities know. One that takes longer but requires no fire at all. It's called the SOTIS method, though the Amish have been doing it for generations before anyone gave it a scientific name. You take clean glass or clear plastic bottles, and they use glass when they can, because plastic wasn't always available, and you fill them with water that's already reasonably clean. Not swamp water, not visibly dirty water, just water that's questionable, water you're not certain about. Then you set those bottles in direct sunlight for a full day, 6 to 8 hours minimum, but a full day is better. The ultraviolet radiation from the sun penetrates the water and destroys the pathogens. It's free. It's passive. You fill the bottles in the morning, and by evening you have clean water. The older women in the community used this method during the summer months, when they had abundant sunlight and needed water for washing, for cooking, for animals. And then there's the method for when you have neither fire nor direct sunlight, neither time nor resources. This one is ancient. It's called sand filtration. And it doesn't make unsafe water completely safe, but it removes particles, debris, cloudiness, and many of the larger organisms. You layer sand and small stones in a container, cloth over the bottom so nothing escapes, then larger stones, then smaller stones, then coarse sand, then finer sand, then cloth on top. You pour questionable water through from the top and it filters out slowly through the bottom, cleaner than when it went in. It's not a perfect system. It won't save you from chemical contamination or viruses so small they pass through sand. But for water that's just cloudy, that has sediment, that has been sitting around, it works. And when you combine it with boiling afterward, you have water that's safe enough to drink without fear. This is how people survived before we had any of our modern infrastructure. Observation, simple tools, patience, and understanding how nature actually works. Now, the Amish also know something about shelter that we've largely forgotten, and I'm not talking about building a house. I'm talking about understanding your environment well enough to use it for protection. A root cellar isn't just about food storage, it's about temperature, it's about humidity, it's about physics. A root cellar, dug properly just a few feet below ground, maintains a constant temperature of 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of whether it's summer or winter outside. No electricity, no cooling system, just earth. The deeper you go, the more stable the temperature becomes. This is why the plain communities always knew that root cellars were essential, not just for keeping vegetables from rotting, but for survival. In winter, that steady temperature above freezing means food doesn't freeze solid and become unusable. In summer, it means food doesn't spoil in the heat. But before you had a root cellar, before you had the resources or the time to dig one, the plain communities understood the next best thing: evaporative cooling. You take a cloth, you keep it wet, and you drape it over stored food or hang it in front of a food storage area. As water evaporates from the cloth, it pulls heat away from everything beneath it. On a hot day, that simple evaporative cooling can drop the temperature by 10-15 degrees. It's not refrigeration. It's not air conditioning. It's physics, using nothing but water and cloth and moving air. This is how food survived in summer kitchens before electricity. This is how vegetables lasted weeks longer than they would in a sealed cupboard. The Amish still do this in their summer houses during the warm months. They're not doing it because they're quaint or nostalgic. They're doing it because it works. And then there's something the modern world has almost completely lost. Something that's becoming urgent again as people realize we cannot rely on systems that depend on constant electricity. It's the knowledge of preserving meat and fish without any refrigeration at all. The Amish know 4 primary methods, and they've known them for centuries. First is smoking. Meat exposed to cool smoke from a fire, over days or even weeks, develops a protective layer. The smoke itself acts as a preservative, preventing bacteria from taking hold. A properly smoked ham or fish can last for months, even in a warm climate. The smoke also imparts flavor, which is why smoked meat tastes the way it does. It's not a flavor accident. It's a functional consequence of preservation. Second is salting. Salt draws water out of meat. Bacteria need moisture to grow. Remove the moisture, and you remove the conditions for spoilage. A piece of meat covered heavily in salt, left in a cool place, becomes shelf-stable. The cured meat becomes drier, harder, more concentrated in flavor. This is why salt pork existed, why bacon was developed, why dried beef jerky became a staple. It wasn't about taste alone. It was about survival through seasons when fresh food was impossible. Third is fermentation. Salted meat, packed in certain conditions, develops beneficial bacteria that actually prevent harmful bacteria from taking hold. This is the principle behind things like fermented fish sauce or fermented meat products. The good organisms preserve the food by making it an environment where bad organisms cannot survive. And fourth is rendering. The fat is extracted from the meat and stored separately. The rendered fat, lard, is shelf-stable almost indefinitely. It becomes a cooking medium, a preservation medium, and a caloric storage system all at once. Meat cooked and then covered completely in rendered fat cannot spoil, because the fat seals it off from air and from the organisms that need air to survive. This is why lard was so central to survival. It wasn't just something you cooked with, it was food storage itself. The reason I'm telling you all of this isn't just because it's interesting history. It's because every single one of these skills is something you can learn, practice, and master right now. You don't need to wait for an emergency. You don't need to move to an Amish community. You don't need permission or special equipment. You can start with bread. Make it once a week until you understand how it actually behaves. Then taste someone else's bread. Ask them what they do differently. Notice where your hands and their hands move in different ways. That's learning through presence. You can test your water. Know where it comes from. Learn to boil it. Try the sun method in summer and see if it works where you live. Write down what happens. These observations become knowledge. You can visit a farmer's market and ask the person selling meat how they preserve it. You can learn about smoking by watching videos, by reading old books, by visiting historical sites where they still do it the old way. You can preserve your first batch of something, anything, and taste it a month later and feel the satisfaction of having actually made it work. The knowledge your great-grandparents had didn't come from books or videos. It came from necessity and from community. But it also came from paying attention, from watching carefully, from asking questions, from being willing to fail and try again. And here's what most people don't realize. The skills are easier now than they ever were. You can look something up instantly. You can find a tutorial. You can fail safely in your own kitchen without starving. The barrier isn't knowledge anymore. The barrier is whether you believe it's worth your time. The Amish and Plain communities have never stopped knowing these things because they've never stopped needing them. Not because they're stubborn or resistant to change, but because they understood something that the modern world is only beginning to remember. You cannot outsource your survival. You cannot hand off all of your knowledge to a system and then be surprised when that system fails you. When the grid fails, and eventually, somewhere, it will, you won't have Google. When supply chains break, you won't have grocery stores. When convenience disappears, what remains is what you actually know how to do with your own hands. The good news is that none of this is hard. None of it requires genius. None of it requires you to abandon your modern life. It just requires that you pick one skill, just one, and that you practice it until it becomes part of who you are. Until your hands know what to do without your brain having to think about it. Start with bread, or water, or preserving something that spoils easily. Pick one and commit to it. Learn it the way the Amish learn it, by doing it, by paying attention to what actually happens, by being willing to fail, by tasting the results, and by sharing what you discover with someone else. That's where the real knowledge lives. Not in any single video or book, but in the combination of your willingness to learn, your hands doing the work, and your commitment to remembering what the world almost let us forget. The forgotten roots are still there. They're waiting. And they're much closer than you think. Thank you so much for watching all 3 parts of this series with me. The knowledge your ancestors carried is not lost. It's just sleeping, waiting for hands willing to wake it up again. If this resonates with you, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover another forgotten skill. Like this video if you learned something that matters, and let me know in the comments which of these techniques you're going to try first. I'll be back soon with more forgotten roots. Until then, keep learning the old ways.